Part 2. Organizational Team Warfare. You may have brilliant ideas, you may be able to invent unbeatable strategies, but if the group that you depend on to execute your plans is unresponsive and uncreative, and if its members always put their personal agendas first, your ideas will mean nothing. You must learn the lesson of war. It is the structure of the army, the chain of command, and the relationship of the parts to the whole that will give your strategies force. The primary goal in war is to build speed and mobility into the very structure of your army. That means having a single authority on top, avoiding the hesitancy and confusion of divided leadership. It means giving soldiers a sense of the overall goal to be accomplished and the latitude to take action to meet that goal. Instead of reacting like automatons, they are able to respond to events in the field. Finally, it means motivating soldiers, creating an overall esprit de corps that gives them irresistible momentum. With forces organized in this manner, a general can adapt to circumstances faster than the enemy can, gaining a decided advantage. The military model is extremely adaptable to any group. It has one simple requirement. Before formulating a strategy or taking action, understand the structure of your group. You can always change it and redesign it to fit your purposes. The following 3 sections of this program will help you focus on this critical issue and give you strategic options, possible organizational models to follow, as well as disastrous mistakes to avoid. 5. Avoid the snares of groupthink, the command and control strategy. The problem in leading any group is that people inevitably have their own agendas. If you are too authoritarian, they will resent you and rebel in silent ways. If you are too easygoing, they will revert to their natural selfishness and you will lose control. You have to create a chain of command in which people do not feel constrained by your influence, yet follow your lead. Put the right people in place, people who will enact the spirit of your ideas without being automatons. Make your commands clear and inspiring, focusing attention on the team, not the leader. Create a sense of participation, but do not fall into groupthink, the irrationality of collective decision-making. Make yourself look like a paragon of fairness, but never relinquish unity of command. Remote control. In the late 1930s, U.S. Brigadier General George C. Marshall, 1880-1958, preached the need for major military reform. The Army had too few soldiers, they were badly trained, current doctrine was ill-suited to modern technology. The list of problems went on. In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had to select his next Army Chief of Staff. The appointment was critical. World War II had begun in Europe, and Roosevelt believed that the United States was sure to get involved. He understood the need for military reform, so he bypassed generals with more seniority and experience and chose Marshall for the job. The appointment was a curse in disguise, for the War Department was hopelessly dysfunctional. Many of its generals had monstrous egos and the power to impose their way of doing things. Senior officers, instead of retiring, took jobs in the department, amassing power bases and fiefdoms that they did everything they could to protect. A place of feuds, waste, communication breakdowns, and overlapping jobs, the department was a mess. How could Marshall revamp the Army for global war if he could not control it? How could he create order and efficiency? Some 10 years earlier, Marshall had served as the assistant commander of the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he had trained many officers. Throughout his time there, he had kept a notebook in which he recorded the names of promising young men. Soon after becoming Chief of Staff, Marshall began to retire the older officers in the War Department and replace them with these younger men whom he had personally trained. These officers were ambitious. They shared his desire for reform, and he encouraged them to speak their minds and show initiative. They included men like Omar Bradley and Mark Clark, who would be crucial in World War II. But no one was more important than the protege Marshall spent the most time on, Dwight D. Eisenhower. The relationship began a few days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when Marshall asked Eisenhower, then a colonel, to prepare a report on what should be done in the Far East. The report showed Marshall that Eisenhower shared his ideas on how to run the war. For the next few months, he kept Eisenhower in the War Plans Division and watched him closely. The two men met every day, and in that time, Eisenhower soaked up Marshall's style of leadership, his way of getting things done. Marshall tested Eisenhower's patience by indicating that he planned to keep him in Washington instead of giving him the field assignment that he desperately wanted. The colonel passed the test. Much like Marshall himself, he got along well with other officers, yet was quietly forceful. In July 1942, as the Americans prepared to enter the war by fighting alongside the British in North Africa, Marshall surprised one and all by naming Eisenhower commander in the European theater of operations. Eisenhower was, by this time, a lieutenant general, but was still relatively unknown, and in his first few months in the job, as the Americans fared poorly in North Africa, the British clamored for a replacement. But Marshall stood by his man, offering him advice and encouragement. One key suggestion was for Eisenhower to develop a protege, much as Marshall had with him, a kind of roving deputy who thought the way he did and would act as his go-between with subordinates. Marshall's suggestion for the post was Major General Bradley, a man he knew well. Eisenhower accepted the idea, essentially duplicating the staff structure that Marshall had created in the War Department. With Bradley in place, Marshall left Eisenhower alone. Marshall positioned his protégés throughout the War Department, where they quietly spread his way of doing things. To make the task easier, he cut the waste in the department with utter ruthlessness, reducing from 60 to 6 the number of deputies who reported to him. Marshall hated excess. His reports to Roosevelt made him famous for his ability to summarize a complex situation in a few pages. The 6 men who reported to him found that any report that lasted a page too long simply went unread. He would listen to their oral presentations with rapt attention, but the minute they wandered from the topic or said something not thought through, he would look away, bored, uninterested. It was an expression they dreaded. Without saying a word, he had made it known that they had displeased him, and it was time for them to leave. Marshall's 6 deputies began to think like him, and to demand from those who reported to them the efficiency and streamlined communication style he demanded of them. The speed of the information flow up and down the line was now quadrupled. Marshall exuded authority, but never yelled and never challenged men frontally. He had a knack for communicating his wishes indirectly, a skill that was all the more effective since it made his officers think about what he meant. Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves, the military director of the project to develop the atom bomb, once came to Marshall's office to get him to sign off on $100 million in expenditures. Finding the chief of staff engrossed in paperwork, he waited while Marshall diligently compared documents and made notes. Finally, Marshall put down his pen, examined the $100 million request, signed it, and returned it to Groves without a word. The general thanked him and was turning to leave when Marshall finally spoke. "It may interest you to know what I was doing. I was writing the check for $3.52 for grass seed for my lawn." The thousands who worked under Marshall, whether in the War Department or abroad in the field, did not have to see him personally to feel his presence. They felt it in the terse but insightful reports that reached them from his deputies, in the speed of the responses to their questions and requests, in the department's efficiency and team spirit. They felt it in the leadership style of men like Eisenhower, who had absorbed Marshall's diplomatic yet forceful way of doing things. In a few short years, Marshall transformed the War Department and the U.S. Army. Few really understood how he had done it. Interpretation. When Marshall became Chief of Staff, he knew that he would have to hold himself back. The temptation was to do combat with everyone in every problem area. The recalcitrance of the generals, the political feuds, the layers of waste. But Marshall was too smart to give in to that temptation. He had to rule indirectly through others, controlling with such a light touch that no one would realize how thoroughly he dominated. The key to Marshall's strategy was his selection, grooming, and placement of his protégés. He metaphorically cloned himself in these men, who enacted the spirit of his reforms on his behalf, saving him time and making him appear not as a manipulator, but as a delegator. Like the War Department that Marshall inherited, today's world is complex and chaotic. It is harder than ever to exercise control through a chain of command. You cannot supervise everything yourself. You cannot keep your eye on everyone. Being seen as a dictator will do you harm, but if you submit to complexity and let go of the chain of command, chaos will consume you. The solution is to do as Marshall did, operate through a kind of remote control. Hire deputies who share your vision but can think on their own, acting as you would in their place. Instead of wasting time negotiating with every difficult person, work on spreading a spirit of camaraderie and efficiency that becomes self-policing. Streamline the organization, cutting out waste, in staff, in the irrelevant reports on your desk, in pointless meetings. The less attention you spend on petty details, the more time you will have for the larger picture, for asserting your authority generally and indirectly. People will follow your lead without feeling bullied. That is the ultimate in control. Keys to warfare. Now, more than ever, effective leadership requires a deft and subtle touch. The reason is simple. We have grown more distrustful of authority. At the same time, almost all of us imagine ourselves as authorities in our own right, officers, not foot soldiers. Feeling the need to assert themselves, people today put their own interests before the team. Group unity is fragile and can easily crack. These trends affect leaders in ways they barely know. The tendency is to give more power to the group. Wanting to seem democratic, leaders poll the whole staff for opinions, let the group make decisions, give subordinates input into the crafting of an overall strategy. Without realizing it, these leaders are letting the politics of the day seduce them into violating one of the most important rules of warfare and leadership: unity of command. Before it is too late, learn the lessons of war. Divided leadership is a recipe for disaster, the cause of the greatest military defeats in history. Among the foremost of these defeats was the Battle of Cannae in 216 B.C. between the Romans and the Carthaginians led by Hannibal. The Romans outnumbered the Carthaginians 2-1, but were virtually annihilated in a perfectly executed strategic envelopment. Hannibal, of course, was a military genius, but the Romans take much of the blame for their own defeat. They had a faulty command system, with 2 tribunes sharing leadership of the army. Disagreeing over how to fight Hannibal, these men fought each other as much as they fought him, and they made a mess of things. Divided leadership is dangerous because people in groups often think and act in ways that are illogical and ineffective. Call it groupthink. People in groups are political. They say and do things that they think will help their image within the group. They aim to please others, to promote themselves, rather than to see things dispassionately. Where an individual can be bold and creative, a group is often afraid of risk. The need to find a compromise among all the different egos kills creativity. The group has a mind of its own, and that mind is cautious, slow to decide, unimaginative, and sometimes downright irrational. This is the game you must play. Do whatever you can to preserve unity of command. Keep the strings to be pulled in your hands. The overarching strategic vision must come from you and you alone. At the same time, hide your tracks. Work behind the scenes. Make the group feel involved in your decisions. Seek their advice, incorporating their good ideas, politely deflecting their bad ones. If necessary, make minor cosmetic strategy changes to assuage the insecure political animals in the group, but ultimately, trust your own vision. Remember the dangers of group decision-making. The first rule of effective leadership is never to relinquish your unity of command. A critical step in creating an efficient chain of command is assembling a skilled team that shares your goals and values. That team gives you many advantages: spirited, motivated people who can think on their own, an image as a delegator, a fair and democratic leader, and a saving in your own valuable energy, which you can redirect toward the larger picture. In creating this team, you are looking for people who make up for your deficiencies, who have the skills you lack. Be careful in assembling this team that you are not seduced by expertise and intelligence. Character, the ability to work under you and with the rest of the team, and the capacity to accept responsibility and think independently are equally key. That is why Marshall tested Eisenhower for so long. You may not have as much time to spare, but never choose a man merely by his glittering resume. Look beyond his skills to his psychological makeup. Rely on the team you have assembled, but do not be its prisoner or give it undue influence. Franklin D. Roosevelt had his infamous brain trust, the advisors and cabinet members on whom he depended for their ideas and opinions. But he never let them in on the actual decision-making, and he kept them from building up their own power base within the administration. He saw them simply as tools, extending his own abilities and saving him valuable time. He understood unity of command and was never seduced into violating it. A key function of any chain of command is to supply information rapidly from the trenches, letting you adapt fast to circumstances. The shorter and more streamlined the chain of command, the better for the flow of information. Even so, information is often diluted as it passes up the chain. The telling details that reveal so much become standardized and general as they are filtered through formal channels. Some on the chain, too, will interpret the information for you, filtering what you hear. To get more direct knowledge, you might occasionally want to visit the field yourself. Marshall would sometimes drop in on an army base incognito to see with his own eyes how his reforms were taking effect. He would also read letters from soldiers. But in these days of increasing complexity, this can consume far too much of your time. What you need is what the military historian Martin van Creveld calls a directed telescope. People in various parts of the chain and elsewhere to give you instant information from the battlefield. These people, an informal network of friends, allies, and spies, let you bypass the slow-moving chain. In general, it is important to cultivate these directed telescopes and plant them throughout the group. They give you flexibility in the chain, room to maneuver in a generally rigid environment. The single greatest risk to your chain of command comes from the political animals in the group. People like this are inescapable. They spring up like weeds in any organization. Not only are they out for themselves, but they would build factions to further their own agendas and fracture the cohesion you have built. Interpreting your commands for their own purposes, finding loopholes in any ambiguity, they create invisible breaks in the chain. Try to weed them out before they arrive. In hiring your team, look at the candidates' histories. Are they restless? Do they often move from place to place? That is a sign of the kind of ambition that will keep them from fitting in. When people seem to share your ideas exactly, be wary. They are probably mirroring them to charm you. Do not be naive. Once you identify the moles in the group, you must act fast to stop them from building a power base from which to destroy your authority. Finally, pay attention to the orders themselves, their form as well as their substance. Vague orders are worthless. As they pass from person to person, they are hopelessly altered, and your staff comes to see them as symbolizing uncertainty and indecision. It is critical that you yourself be clear about what you want before issuing your orders. On the other hand, if your commands are too specific and too narrow, you will encourage people to behave like automatons and stop thinking for themselves, which they must do when the situation requires it. Erring in neither direction is an art. Reversal. No good can ever come of divided leadership. If you are ever offered a position in which you will have to share command, turn it down, for the enterprise will fail and you will be held responsible. Better to take a lower position and let the other person have the job. 6. Segment your forces. The controlled chaos strategy. The critical elements in war are speed and adaptability, the ability to move and make decisions faster than the enemy. But speed and adaptability are hard to achieve today. We have more information than ever before at our fingertips, making interpretation and decision-making more difficult. We have more people to manage, those people are more widely spread, and we face more uncertainty. Learn from Napoleon, warfare's greatest master. Speed and adaptability come from flexible organization. Break your forces into independent groups that can operate and make decisions on their own. Make your forces elusive and unstoppable by infusing them with the spirit of the campaign, giving them a mission to accomplish, and then letting them run. Calculated disorder. In 1800, by defeating Austria in the Battle of Marengo, Napoleon gained control of northern Italy and forced the Austrians to sign a treaty recognizing French territorial gains there and in Belgium. For the next 5 years, an uneasy peace held sway. But Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France, and many in Europe began to suspect that this Corsican upstart had limitless ambitions. Karl Marx, the Austrian quartermaster general, and an older and influential member of the Austrian military, advocated a preemptive strike against France, with an army large enough to guarantee victory. He told his colleagues, "In war, the object is to beat the enemy, not merely to avoid being beaten." Marx and like-minded officers slowly gained influence, and in April 1805, Austria, England, and Russia signed a treaty of alliance to wage war on France and force her to return to her pre-Napoleonic borders. That summer, they formulated their plan. 95,000 Austrian troops would attack the French in northern Italy, redressing the humiliating defeat of 1800. Another 23,000 troops would secure the Tyrol between Italy and Austria. Marx would then lead a force of 70,000 men west along the Danube into Bavaria, preventing this strategically located country from allying itself with France. Once encamped in Bavaria, Marx and his army would await the arrival a few weeks later of 75,000 troops from Russia. The two armies would link up, and this unstoppable force would march west into France. Meanwhile, the English would attack the French at sea. More troops would later be funneled into each war zone, making for an army totaling 500,000 men overall, the largest military force ever assembled in Europe up to that point. Not even Napoleon could withstand an army more than twice the size of his own, moving in on him from all sides. In the middle of September, Marx began his phase of the campaign by advancing along the Danube to Ulm, in the heart of Bavaria. Having established his camp there, he felt hugely satisfied. Mach loathed disorder and uncertainty. He tried to think of everything in advance, to come up with a clear plan and make sure everyone stuck to it. Clockwork warfare, he called it. He thought his plan was perfect. Nothing could go wrong. Napoleon was doomed. Mach had once been captured and forced to spend 3 years in France, where he had studied Napoleon's style of war. A key Napoleonic strategy was to make the enemy divide his forces, but now the trick was reversed. With trouble in Italy, Napoleon could not afford to send more than 70,000 French troops across the Rhine into Germany and Bavaria. The moment he crossed the Rhine, the Austrians would know his intentions and would act to slow his march. His army would need at least 2 months to reach Ulm and the Danube. By then, the Austrians would already have linked up with the Russians and swept through the Alsace and France. The strategy was as close to foolproof as any Mach had ever known. For Mach, the Russians could not arrive in Ulm too soon. Near the end of September, however, Mach began to sense something wrong. To the west of Ulm lay the Black Forest, between his own position and the French border. Suddenly, scouts were telling him that a French army was passing through the forest in his direction. Mach was bewildered. It made the best sense for Napoleon to cross the Rhine into Germany farther to the north, where his passage east would be smoother and harder to stop. But now he was yet again doing the unexpected, funneling an army through a narrow opening in the Black Forest and sending it straight at Mach. Even if this move were just a feint, Mach had to defend his position, so he sent part of his army west into the Black Forest to stem the French advance long enough for the Russians to come to his aid. A few days later, Mach began to feel horribly confused. The French were proceeding through the Black Forest, and some of their cavalry had come quite far. At the same time, though, word reached Mach of a large French army somewhere to the north of his position. The reports were contradictory. Some said this army was at Stuttgart, 60 miles northwest of Ulm. Others had it more to the east or even farther to the north, or quite close, near the Danube. Mach could get no hard information, since the French cavalry that had come through the Black Forest blocked access to the north for reconnaissance. The Austrian general now faced what he feared most: uncertainty, and it was clouding his ability to think straight. Finally, he ordered all of his troops back to Ulm, where he would concentrate his forces. Perhaps Napoleon intended to do battle at Ulm. At least Mach would have equal numbers. In early October, Austrian scouts were at last able to find out what was really going on, and it was a nightmare. A French army had crossed the Danube to the east of Ulm, blocking Mach's way back to Austria and cutting off the Russians. Another army lay to the south, blocking his route to Italy. How could 70,000 French soldiers appear in so many places at once, and move so fast? Gripped by panic, Mach sent probes in every direction. On October 11th, his men discovered a weak point. Only a small French force barred the way north and east. There he could push through and escape the French encirclement. He began to prepare for the march. But 2 days later, when he was on the point of ordering the retreat, his scouts reported that a large French force had appeared overnight, blocking the northeastern route as well. On October 20th, finding out that the Russians had decided not to come to his rescue, Mach surrendered. Over 60,000 Austrian soldiers were taken prisoner with hardly a shot fired. It was one of the most splendidly bloodless victories in history. In the next few months, Napoleon's army turned east to deal with the Russians and remaining Austrians, culminating in his spectacular victory at Austerlitz. Meanwhile, Mach languished in an Austrian prison, sentenced to 2 years for his role in this humiliating defeat. There he racked his brains, losing his sanity in the process, some said. Where had this plan gone wrong? How had an army appeared out of nowhere to his east, so easily swallowing him up? He had never seen anything like it, and he was trying to figure it out to the end of his days. Interpretation. History should not judge General Mock too harshly, for the French armies he faced in the fall of 1805 represented one of the greatest revolutions in military history. For thousands of years, war had been fought in essentially the same way. The commander led his large and unified army into battle against an opponent of roughly equal size. He would never break up his army into smaller units, for that would violate the military principle of keeping one's forces concentrated. Furthermore, scattering his forces would make them harder to monitor, and he would lose control over the battle. Suddenly, Napoleon changed all that. In the years of peace between 1800 and 1805, he reorganized the French military, bringing different forces together to form the Grande Armée, 210,000 men strong. He divided this army into several corps, each with its own cavalry, infantry, artillery, and general staff. Each was led by a marshal general, usually a young officer of proven strength in previous campaigns. Varying in size from 15,000 to 30,000 men, each corps was a miniature army headed by a miniature Napoleon. The key to the system was the speed with which the corps could move. Napoleon would give the marshals their missions, then let them accomplish it on their own. Little time was wasted with the passing of orders back and forth, and smaller armies needing less baggage could march with greater speed. Instead of a single army moving in a straight line, Napoleon could disperse and concentrate his corps in limitless patterns, which to the enemy seemed chaotic and unreadable. This was the monster that Napoleon unleashed on Europe in September 1805. Understand, the future belongs to groups that are fluid, fast, and nonlinear. Your natural tendency as a leader may be to want to control the group, to coordinate its every movement, but that will just tie you to the past and to the slow-moving armies of history. It takes strength of character to allow for a margin of chaos and uncertainty, to let go a little. But by decentralizing your army and segmenting it into teams, you will gain in mobility what you lose in complete control. And mobility is the greatest force multiplier of them all. It allows you to both disperse and concentrate your army, throwing it into patterns instead of advancing in straight lines. These patterns will confuse and paralyze your opponents. Give your different corps clear missions that fit your strategic goals. Then, let them accomplish them as they see fit. Smaller teams are faster, more creative, more adaptable. Their officers and soldiers are more engaged, more motivated. In the end, fluidity will bring you far more power and control than petty domination. Keys to warfare. The world is full of people looking for a secret formula for success and power. They do not want to think on their own, they just want a recipe to follow. They are attracted to the idea of strategy for that very reason. In their minds, strategy a goal. They want these steps spelled out for them by an expert or a guru. Believing in the power of imitation, they want to know exactly what some great person has done before. Their maneuvers in life are as mechanical as their thinking. To separate yourself from such a crowd, you need to get rid of a common misconception. The essence of strategy is not to carry out a brilliant plan that proceeds in steps. It is to put yourself in situations where you have more options than the enemy does. Instead of grasping at option A as the single right answer, true strategy is positioning yourself to be able to do A, B, or C, depending on the circumstances. That is strategic depth of thinking, as opposed to formulaic thinking. Sun Tzu expressed this idea differently. What you aim for in strategy, he said, is shi, a position of potential force. The position of a boulder perched precariously on a hilltop, say, or of a bowstring stretched taut. A tap on the boulder, the release of the bowstring, and potential force is violently unleashed. The boulder or arrow can go in any direction. It is geared to the actions of the enemy. What matters is not following preordained steps, but placing yourself in shi and giving yourself options. Napoleon had always aimed at his version of shi, and he perfected it in the 1805 campaign. Obsessed with structure and organization, he developed the core system, building flexibility into the very skeleton of his army. The lesson is simple. A rigid, centralized organization locks you into linear strategies. A fluid, segmented army gives you options, endless possibilities for reaching shi. Structure is strategy, perhaps the most important strategic choice you will make. Should you inherit a group, analyze its structure and alter it to suit your purposes. Pour your creative energy into its organization, making fluidity your goal. Finally, you need to structure your group according to your soldiers' strengths and weaknesses, to their social circumstances. To do that, you must be attuned to the human side of your troops. You must understand them and the spirit of the times, inside and out. During the American Civil War, the Union generals struggled with the ragtag nature of their army. Unlike the disciplined, well-trained troops of the Confederacy, many Northern soldiers had been forcibly conscripted at the last minute. They were pioneers, rugged frontiersmen, and they were fiercely independent. Some generals tried desperately to instill discipline, and mostly they failed. Others just paid attention to map strategy, while their armies continued to perform badly. General William Tecumseh Sherman had a different solution. He changed his organization to suit the personalities of his men. He created a more democratic army, encouraged initiative in his officers, let them dress as they saw fit. He loosened outward discipline to foster morale and group spirit. Like frontiersmen generally, his soldiers were restless and nomadic. So he exploited their mobility and kept his army in perpetual motion, always marching faster than his enemies could. Of all the Union armies, Sherman's were the most feared and performed the best. Like Sherman, do not struggle with your soldiers' idiosyncrasies, but rather turn them into a virtue, a way to increase your potential force. Be creative with the group's structure, keeping your mind as fluid and adaptable as the army you lead. Reversal. Even if you run a looser organization, there may be times when you will have to tighten it and give your officers less freedom. Wise generals set nothing in stone, always retaining the ability to reorganize their army to fit the times and their changing needs. 7. Transform your war into a crusade. Morale strategies. The secret to motivating people and maintaining their morale is to get them to think less about themselves and more about the group. Involve them in a cause, a crusade against a hated enemy. Make them see their survival as tied to the success of the army as a whole. In a group in which people have truly bonded, moods and emotions are so contagious that it becomes easy to infect your troops with enthusiasm. Lead from the front. Let your soldiers see you in the trenches, making sacrifices for the cause. That will fill them with the desire to emulate and please you. Make both rewards and punishments rare, but meaningful. Remember, a motivated army can work wonders, making up for any lack of material resources. The art of man management. Learn from history's great motivators and military leaders. The way to get soldiers to work together and maintain morale is to make them feel part of a group that is fighting for a worthy cause. That distracts them from their own interests and satisfies their human need to feel part of something bigger than they are. The more they think of the group, the less they think of themselves. They soon begin to link their own success to the group's. Their own interests and the larger interests coincide. In this kind of army, people know that selfish behavior will disgrace them in the eyes of their companions. They become attuned to a kind of group conscience. Morale is contagious. Put people in a cohesive, animated group, and they naturally catch that spirit. If they rebel or revert to selfish behavior, they are easily isolated. You must establish this dynamic the minute you become the group's leader. It can only come from the top, that is, from you. The ability to create the right group dynamic, to maintain the collective spirit, is known in military language as man management. History's great generals, Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Napoleon, were all masters of the art, which for military men is more than simply important. In battle, it can be the deciding issue, a matter of life and death. In war, Napoleon once said, "The moral is to the physical as 3 to 1. He meant that his troops' fighting spirit was crucial in the outcome of the battle. With motivated soldiers, he could beat an army 3 times the size of his own. To create the best group dynamic and prevent destructive morale problems, follow these 8 crucial steps, culled from the writings and experiences of the masters of the art. It is important to follow as many of the steps as possible. None is less important than any other. Step 1. Unite your troops around a cause. Make them fight for an idea. Bring people together around a cause, and you create a motivated force. The cause can be anything you wish, but you should represent it as progressive. It fits the times. It is on the side of the future, so it is destined to succeed. If necessary, you can give it a veneer of spirituality. It is best to have some kind of enemy to hate. An enemy can help a group to define itself in opposition. Ignore this step, and you are left with an army of mercenaries. You will deserve the fate that usually awaits such armies. Step 2. Keep their bellies full. People cannot stay motivated if their material needs go unmet. If they feel exploited in any way, their natural selfishness will come to the surface, and they will begin to peel off from the group. Attending to their physical needs will make it easier to ask more of them when the time comes. Step 3. Lead from the front. The enthusiasm with which people join a cause inevitably wanes. One thing that speeds up its loss and that produces discontent is the feeling that the leaders do not practice what they preach. Right from the beginning, your troops must see you leading from the front, sharing their dangers and sacrifices, taking the cause as seriously as they do. Instead of trying to push them from behind, make them run to keep up with you. Step 4. Concentrate their qi. There is a Chinese belief in an energy called qi, which dwells in all living things. All groups have their own level of qi, physical and psychological. A leader must understand this energy and know how to manipulate it. Idleness has a terrible effect on qi. When soldiers are not working, their spirits lower, doubts creep in, and selfish interests take over. Similarly, being on the defensive, always waiting and reacting to what the enemy dishes out, will also lower qi. So keep your soldiers busy, acting for a purpose, moving in a direction. Propelling them forward will excite them and make them hungry for battle. Aggressive action concentrates qi, and concentrated qi is full of latent force. Step 5. Play to their emotions. The best way to motivate people is not through reason, but through emotion. Humans, however, are naturally defensive, and if you begin with an appeal to their emotions, some histrionic harangue, they will see you as manipulative and will recoil. An emotional appeal needs a setup. Lower their defenses and make them bond as a group by putting on a show, entertaining them, telling a story. Now they have less control over their emotions, and you can approach them more directly, moving them easily from laughter to anger or hatred. Masters of man management have a sense of drama. They know when and how to hit their soldiers in the gut. Step 6. Mix harshness and kindness. The key to man management is a balance of punishment and reward. Too many rewards will spoil your soldiers and make them take you for granted. Too much punishment will destroy their morale. You need to hit the right balance. Make your kindness rare, and even an occasional warm comment or generous act will be powerfully meaningful. Anger and punishment should be equally rare. Instead, your harshness should take the form of setting very high standards that few can reach. Make your soldiers compete to please you. Make them struggle to see less harshness and more kindness. Step 7. Build the group myth. The armies with the highest morale are armies that have been tested in battle. Soldiers who have fought alongside one another through many campaigns forge a kind of group myth based on their past victories. Living up to the tradition and reputation of the group becomes a matter of pride. Anyone who lets it down feels ashamed. To generate this myth, you must lead your troops into as many campaigns as you can. Success alone will help bring the group together. Create symbols and slogans that fit the myth. Your soldiers will want to belong. Step 8. Be ruthless with grumblers. Allow grumblers and the chronically disaffected any leeway at all, and they will spread disquiet and even panic throughout the group. As fast as you can, you must isolate them and get rid of them. Historical example. In the early 1630s, Oliver Cromwell, 1599-1658, a provincial gentleman farmer in Cambridgeshire, England, fell victim to a depression and to constant thoughts of death. Deep in crisis, he converted to the Puritan religion, and suddenly his life took a new turn. He felt he had experienced a direct communion with God. Now he believed in providence, the idea that everything happens for a reason and according to God's will. Whereas before he had been despondent and indecisive, now he was filled with purpose. He thought himself among God's elect. Eventually, Cromwell became a member of Parliament and a vocal defender of the common people in their grievances against the aristocracy. Yet he felt marked by providence for something larger than politics. He had visions of a great crusade. In 1642, Parliament, in a bitter struggle with Charles I, voted to cut off the king's funds until he agreed to limits on royal power. When Charles refused, civil war broke out between the Cavaliers, supporters of the king who wore their hair long, and the Roundheads, the rebels so called since they cropped their hair short. Parliament's most fervent supporters were Puritans like Cromwell, who saw the war against the king as his chance, more than his chance, his calling. Although Cromwell had no military background, he hurriedly formed a troop of 60 horsemen from his native Cambridgeshire. His aim was to incorporate them in a larger regiment, gain military experience by fighting under another commander, and slowly prove his worth. He was confident of ultimate victory, for he saw his side as unbeatable. After all, God was on their side, and all his men were believers in the cause of creating a more pious England. Despite his lack of experience, Cromwell was something of a military visionary. He imagined a new kind of warfare spearheaded by a faster, more mobile cavalry, and in the war's first few months, he proved a brave and effective leader. He was given more troops to command, but soon realized that he had grossly overestimated the fighting spirit of those on his side. Time and again, he led cavalry charges that pierced enemy lines, only to watch in disgust as his soldiers broke order to plunder the enemy camp. Sometimes he tried to hold part of his force in reserve to act as reinforcements later in the battle, but the only command they listened to was to advance, and in retreat they were hopelessly disordered. Representing themselves as crusaders, Cromwell's men were revealed by battle as mercenaries fighting for pay and adventure. They were useless. In 1643, when Cromwell was made a colonel at the head of his own regiment, he decided to break with the past. From now on, he would recruit soldiers of a certain kind, men who, like himself, had experienced religious visions and revelations. He sounded out the aspirants, tested them for the depth of their faith. Departing from a long tradition, he appointed commoners, not aristocrats, as officers. Cromwell made his recruits sing psalms and pray together. In a stern check on bad discipline, he taught them to see all their actions as part of God's plan. And he looked after them in an unusual way for the times, making sure they were well fed, well clothed, and promptly paid. When Cromwell's army went into battle, it was now a force to reckon with. The men rode in tight formation, loudly singing psalms. As they neared the king's forces, they would break into a pretty round trot, not the headlong and disorderly charge of other troops. Even in contact with the enemy, they kept their order, and they retreated with as much discipline as when they advanced. Since they believed that God was with them, they had no fear of death. They could march straight up a hill into enemy fire without breaking step. Having gained control over his cavalry, Cromwell could maneuver them with infinite flexibility. His troops won battle after battle. In 1645, Cromwell was named Lieutenant General of the cavalry in the new model army. That year, at the Battle of Naseby, his disciplined regiment was crucial in the Roundheads' victory. A few days later, his cavalry finished off the Royalist forces at Langport, effectively putting an end to the first stage of the Civil War. Interpretation. That Cromwell is generally considered one of history's great military leaders is all the more remarkable, given that he learned soldiery on the job. During the second stage of the Civil War, he became head of the Roundhead armies, and later, after defeating King Charles and having him executed, he became Lord Protector of England. Although he was ahead of his times with his visions of mobile warfare, Cromwell was not a brilliant strategist or field tactician. His success lay in the morale and discipline of his cavalry, and the secret to those was the quality of the men he recruited, true believers in his cause. Such men were naturally open to his influence and accepting of his discipline. With each new victory, they grew more committed to him and more cohesive. He could ask the most of them. Above all else, then, pay attention to your staff, to those you recruit to your cause. Many will pretend to share your beliefs, but your first battle will show that all they wanted was a job. Soldiers like these are mercenaries and will get you nowhere. True believers are what you want. Expertise and impressive resumes matter less than character and the capacity for sacrifice. Recruits of character will give you a staff already open to your influence, making morale and discipline infinitely easier to attain. This core personnel will spread the gospel for you, keeping the rest of the army in line. As far as possible in this secular world, make battle a religious experience, an ecstatic involvement in something transcending the present. Reversal. If morale is contagious, so is its opposite. Fear and discontent can spread through your troops like wildfire. The only way to deal with them is to cut them off before they turn into panic and rebellion. Waste no time and deal with the whole group. Appeal to their pride and dignity. Make them feel ashamed of their moment of weakness and madness. Remind them of what they have accomplished in the past and show them how they are falling short of the ideal. This social shaming will wake them up and reverse the dynamic.